Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel Am Yetz Hashem today. We will be learning Daf Pei Hey Amud Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today on Pei Dalid Amid Beis, 3 lines off the bottom, end of the line, Siman Shin Aleph Sif Mem Gimel. Our learning should be a schus for Achedu Kol Beis Yisrael Hanusudim B'Tzara B'Shivya Ha'imdim Bein B'Yom U'Bein B'Yabasha Hamakim Yirachem Aleihem V'Yitzia Mitzara L'Rvacha Me'afela L'Oira Mishibud L'Geula Hashta B'Galav Zman Kariv and Emar Amen. Our learning should be a schus refuah shalema for Rachel Shava Basit L'Freda B'Shemer Ben Esther Fradel Tzvi Bed Leah Miriam Chav Hadassah Bas Rezel Serel Dvar Bas Shoshabina Rivka Bas Shira Leah and Yitzchak Ben Tzion Ben Dusha. Our learning should also be a schus. The Rebbeinu Shalom should protect and watch over all of our brothers and sisters who find themselves in harm's way. B'chol Makayim Shehem. So, yesterday in Siman Shin Aleph Mem Beis, we discussed the halacha of a person who's walking in Rishus Harabim and he encounters tefillin. There are tefillin that are laying in Rishus Harabim in an oifen of bizayin. They're not in a makom mishumer. They're unprotected, laying outside in Rishus Harabim. What should he do? So the Mechaber told us, well, first you have to know, is it a shas sakana? Is it a time when there's some kind of governmental anti-Semitic decree and it would be dangerous for you to be caught either wearing tefillin or carrying tefillin or watching over tefillin? In that case, there's nothing you could do. The only thing you could do is protect the tefillin as best as you can, cover them if there's something that you could use to put down over the tefillin. So cover them up and then you go on your way. There's nothing that you could do. If it's not a shas sakana, and therefore you could somehow be caught either with the tefillin or watching over the tefillin, what should you do then? So the Mechaber told us the first thing you have to do is you have to ascertain that they are actually tefillin. Back in the day, there was a chance that they weren't really tefillin. Maybe they were kemeos that were made in the form of tefillin. We learned in the Mishnah Berurah that nowadays that's not really negeya. Nowadays, if you find tefillin, they look like tefillin, they're tefillin. We assume that they're tefillin. Okay, so you found tefillin in Rishus Harabim. It's not a shas sakana. What should you do? So the Mechaber said, well, if the tefillin are affixed with proper ritzuas, and the ritzuas have the necessary knots, you have the kesher of the shalrosh, you have the kesher of the shalyad, and now that means that the tefillin are able to be worn, they're fully outfitted in a way that they could be worn, well then the Mechaber said you have a very simple eitzah. Put the tefillin on. Wear them derech levisha. Now, even though Shabbos is lavzman tefillin, even though generally speaking we don't wear tefillin on Shabbos, but still, if somebody would put on tefillin on Shabbos, if you're putting them on derech levisha, they would be considered a takshit. Since they're considered a takshit, you have a very easy eitzah of how to transport these tefillin to a protected area. Put them on. Now you can walk with them in Rishus Harabim because they're a takshit, and transport them to a makom mishuber. Okay, what do you do if you encounter a whole wholesale package of tefillin? You have 30 pairs of tefillin over here. So, I mean, you could put on one pair, transport it, come back, put on another pair, transport it. But if you have so many pairs over here that there isn't enough time in the day to put them all on and transport them to safety, what should you do then? Said the Mechaber, in that case, camp out over there where the tefillin are, watch over the tefillin until after Shabbos, and then after Shabbos, you'll pick them up and you'll take them home. Okay, what do you do if camping out over there with the tefillin on is not an option? It's a bad neighborhood. It's not safe to camp out over there. In that case, the Mechaber said, either what you could do is you could transport them pachas midalad amas. What does that mean? Scoop them up, walk 3.5 amas, stop. Scoop them up again, walk 3.5 amas, put them down. Scoop them up again, walk 3.5 amas, put them down. In this way, you're never transporting them dalad amas in Rishus Harabim at one time. So what you're doing is an Issa D'Rabbanan. It's not an Issa D'Oraisa. Since what you're doing is an Issa D'Rabbanan, we're going to relax the Issa D'Rabbanan for the kavod of the tefillin. That's what we learned yesterday when it comes to tefillin. Now the Mechaber is going to discuss a slightly different case. What happens if you find not tefillin, but a Sefer Torah. Now, if you find a Sefer Torah, things get a lot more complicated, because by the tefillin, you had an interesting option. You could put the tefillin on, now you're wearing them derech levisha, they become a tachshit, and now you could walk with them in Rosh Hashanah. But what do you do if you find a Sefer Torah? Says the Mechaber Sif Mem Gimel, 3 lines off the bottom, end of the line, Pei Daled Amud Beis. HaMoitzi Sefer Torah Basadeh. If somebody finds a Sefer Torah out in the Sadeh. Interesting to me that the Mechaber chose the word Basadeh. A Sadeh is a field. It's not generally what we would think of as a Rosh Hashanah. A Sadeh, the truth is, the word Sadeh implies more of a Carmelis than a real Rosh Hashanah, because the Bika, the valleys where they planted crops and everything, that's not a Mokum Hiluch Shel B'nei Adam. That's not where people travel. And therefore, that's usually a Carmelis, not a Rosh Hashanah. Okay, just putting that out there. So, Hamaitzi Sefer Torah Basadeh, if somebody found a Sefer Torah out in the Sadeh. So again, here you have a Davar Shebektusha, you have a Sefer Torah with the Shem Hashem in it and everything else, and it's laying in a Sadeh, Ba'ifin Bezayin on Shabbos. What do? So again, the first thing the Mechaber says is, you have to know, are we talking about a Shas Sakana, where you can't be caught with a Sefer Torah or guarding over a Sefer Torah? Or is it not a Shas Sakana? So says the Mechaber, Im Einoi Shas Sakana, if it's not a time of Sakana, so then, okay, what you should do is, Yoshev u'mishamroi u'makshechalav. Stay over there, watch over the Sefer Torah until after Shabbos, and then after Shabbos, you'll go ahead and you'll bring it to safety. That's what you should do if it's not a Shas Sakana. What do you do if it is a Shas Sakana? It says in the parentheses here, Lashon Rambam, Ubesakana meinichai v'hoilachloi. If it's a Shas Sakana, you can't be caught watching over the Sefer Torah, so then you're going to have to leave the Sefer Torah. There's nothing you could do. Now, it happens to be that the Shulchan Aruch Harav points out over here, he says, not just if it's a sakana manichai v'hoilachloi, just like we learned by the tefillin, if it's a shas sakana, you should at least cover the tefillin, says the Shulchan Aruch Harav, over here by the Sefer Torah also. If you're stuck, you can't watch over the Sefer Torah, but at least attempt to go ahead and cover the Sefer Torah. Now, it could be the reason the Mechaber doesn't say that here, or it could be the reason the Rambam also didn't write it, is because it's much easier to cover tefillin than it is to cover Sefer Torah. Tefillin are very small. You could find something, take off a hat or whatever it is, you could find something to cover tefillin. Covering a Sefer Torah is a more difficult affair just because of its size. But having said that, so fine. So the Mechaber says so far, you found a Sefer Torah laying in an Oifid Bezayin in a Sadeh. If it's not a Shas Sakana, so watch over it until after Shabbos. Now, what we have to realize right away, like I said, by the tefillin, you had another option. By the tefillin, you could wear them, and you could take them derech malbush, and you could transport them to a protected area. By a Sefer Torah, to wear them is not a davar pashut at all. How do you wear a Sefer Torah? You're going to have to unroll the Sefer Torah and wrap yourself in the Sefer Torah. Sefer Torah is not a malbush. So, says the Mechaber, what do you do if it's not a Shas Sakana? You do the best you can, which is guard over the Sefer Torah where it is. Continues the Mechaber, however, and he says, V'im hayu geshamim yardim. But what do you do if it's raining? Now, if it's raining, the Sefer Torah could get ruined. Not only could the Sefer Torah get ruined, but the Shemos of Hashem might become erased if the Sefer Torah is going to lay there in the rain. So what do you do if it's raining? V'im hayu geshamim yardim, if it's raining, says the Mechaber, mis'atef be'oyer. You should unroll the Sefer Torah and wrap yourself in the urios of the Sefer Torah. Now, what's fascinating about this is, if you think about it, Sefer Torah is quite long. So you wrap yourself in the Sefer Torah, you're going to be sitting there for half an hour, wrapping and wrapping and wrapping and wrapping and wrapping. I'm not sure what you're going to be like by the time you finish wrapping yourself in the Sefer Torah. But having said that, says the Mechaber, if it's raining, mis'atef ba'or, wrap yourself in the Sefer Torah, v'chayzer u'mechasa oisoi. Now, by wrapping yourself in the Sefer Torah, you still haven't protected the Sefer Torah from the rain. So what you're going to do is you're going to wrap yourself in the Sefer Torah, then put your jacket on over the Sefer Torah, put your coat on over the Sefer Torah that's wrapped up around you. So now the Sefer Torah is protected. And then walk and travel with it and come in to a Rishus HaYachid, come into a protected area with the Sefer Torah. Okay, now, this eitzah of wearing the Sefer Torah, how do we look at this? What's the halachic status, if you will? How does halacha look upon wearing a Sefer Torah? So what are you doing now? You're taking something which is not a malbush. A Sefer Torah is certainly not a garment. You're taking something which is not a malbush, and you're wearing it derech levisha. What do I mean by that? You're wrapping yourself up in it. Now, wrapping yourself up in something is a derech levisha. That is a way to wear a garment, but only if it's a garment. In other words, if you have a wrap, you wrap yourself in a wrap. That's derech levisha. Over here, you're taking a Sefer Torah, and you're wrapping yourself in the Sefer Torah as if the Sefer Torah is a wrap. The problem is that the Sefer Torah is not a wrap. So it's not a malbush. So what you're doing is, you're taking something which is not a malbush, and you're putting it on derech levisha, and you want to transport it in that way. So it's not a malbush, and you want to transport it derech levisha. Where have we had this before? Well, where we had this before was in this siman in Sif Chaf Aleph, which begins on the bottom line of Pei Amud Aleph. Over there we learned in the Mechaber, Ein yotzim b'teva v'kupa u'machatzeles. You're not allowed to go out wearing a box or a basket or a mat. And the Mishnah Berurah told us over there, what you're trying to do over here is, you got caught in the rain. So you want to take a box and you want to put on a box. Or you want to take a mat and you want to wrap yourself in a mat. Okay, so what are you doing over there? You're taking a mat, which is not a malbush, and you're putting it on derech levisha. You're going to wrap yourself around in it. The Mechaber said, Ein yotzim. You're not allowed to do this. Said the Mishnah Berurah, why are you not allowed to do this? Hani lav derech malbushu. Because this is not derech malbush. These are not malbushim. These are not garments. Nobody wears a box. Nobody wears a basket. Nobody wears a mat. So this is not called derech malbush. Since it's not derech malbush, the box, the basket, the mat, what are they? They're a masui. Now, is that an issa d'Rabbanan or is that an issa d'Oraisa? Well, the Mechaber over there said, Ein yotzim. You're not allowed to do it. He didn't say, and if you do it, chayiv, because it's an issa d'Rabbanan. Why is it an issa d'Rabbanan? Very simple. Do the math. These are not malbushim. Okay, a mat is not a malbush. So having said that a mat is not a malbush, if you want to transport a mat, what's the normal way to transport a mat? Roll it up and carry it. A box is not a malbush. Okay, so what's the normal way to transport a box? Carry it. Is it normal to transport a mat by wrapping your body up in it? No. Is it normal to carry a box by putting it on your body? No. So if you do it, you're not being moitziat kederech kol hamitziin. You're not carrying it in the normal way. You're carrying it with a shinui. Oh, you're carrying it with a shinui. That's klachayad. That's only an issa d'Rabbanan, not an issa d'Oraisa. So basically, we already learned in Sif Chaf Aleph that to take something which is not a malbush and put it on derech levisha, right? That's an issa d'Rabbanan. So okay, so what are you doing over here? You're taking a Sefer Torah, which is certainly not a malbush. You're putting it on and you're trying to transport it derech levisha. Oh, it's an issa d'Rabbanan. So what the Mechaber is telling us over here is, you found a Sefer Torah mutal bebizayin outside on Shabbos. What do? Okay, the best thing to do is camp out, watch it until after Shabbos, and then transport it to a protected area after Shabbos. That's the best thing to do. Okay, you can't do it. Why? Because it's raining, so you can't put it there. It's raining, we're going to relax the issa d'Rabbanan, we're going to tell you put it on derech levisha, and wear it derech levisha to a protected area. Now you're only doing something which is innocent d'Rabbanan. Again, don't get confused. You're not elevating this to a malbush. A Sefer Torah is not a malbush. But what you're doing is, since you're putting it on derech levisha, now it's only innocent d'Rabbanan, because you're certainly not being mitziat k'derech kol hamitziyin. So we're going to relax the innocent d'Rabbanan l'chvayid haTorah, and we're going to tell you wear it back. Incidentally, what's not spoken out over here is, yes, the best thing to do is to camp out over there and watch it. Now, if it's not raining. Now, what do you do if you can't camp out and watch the Sefer Torah? Because it's a bad neighborhood. Well, then we would say the same halacha that we said in the previous sif by tefillin. If you can't camp out and watch the Sefer Torah because it's a bad neighborhood, so then transport the Sefer Torah to a protected area, pachas midal amas. Move it 3.5 amas at a time. That would be the eitzah that you would do that. Okay, let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah ois katan kof samach. Geshamim yardim, if it's raining, shetiskalkal ha-Sefer Torah. If you leave it there, the rain will ruin the Sefer Torah. Hitira lay his atef. Then we relax the Yisad Rabbanan and we allow you to put it on. The chayzer u'bisativ bebegadim ilamayla. Then put your clothing on over the Sefer Torah to protect it. V'nichnas, and you'll bring it in. Now, this seems to be a very bizoyandik way to treat a Sefer Torah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, shezeu kvaida. In this case, this is the kavod that you're doing for the Sefer Torah. You're doing this to protect the Sefer Torah from the rain. So this is actually kavod HaTorah. Shaloi tiskalkel b'geshamim, so that it should not become ruined by the rain. Okay, moving along to Sif Mem Dalid, top line, Pei Hei Amud Aleph. Haba lahatzil kelov mipnei hadaleka. Somebody, chas v'shalom lo'eleinu, somebody's experiencing a fire in his house on Shabbos, and Pashut, he wants to save his clothing. He's trying to get as much stuff out of the house as he can. So haba lahatzil kelov mipnei hadaleka, somebody wants to save his clothing from a fire. Loivesh kol ma sheyachal lilbosh. He could put on as much clothing as he could possibly put on. So he could put on 10 shirts and 6 sweaters and 5 jackets and 2 coats. Loivish kama sheyachal lilbosh. He should put on whatever he could put on. Va'oitev kama sheyachal la'atoif. And he could wrap himself in as many layers as he could possibly wrap himself. Upashit, and then when he transports it to someplace safe, he could take it off, and then he could go back, v'chayzer v'loivesh, and he could put on more layers, umaitzi, and by doing that, he could take his stuff out of the house. Says the Mishnah Berurah, ice cotton. No, there is no Mishnah Berurah here on this sif. There is, however, a bir halacha over here. Bir halacha dibra mascha loivesh kol ma sheyachal lilbosh. Again, the reason this is okay is because the keva de derech malbashu shari. Over here, he's actually wearing clothing, and this is called derech levisha. Why is this called derech levisha? Well, there are merchants who will put on a bunch of different garments at the same time. Okay. Weiter. Now, the truth is that this Sif Mem Daled, it's interesting that Sif Mem Daled was put in over here in Siman Shin Aleph. The truth is there's a whole Siman that we're going to learn later on, and it's a very it's a very significant Siman to me. No, actually not. I thought that I began my career saying Dirshu Halacha Shiurim in Siman Shin Lamed Daled, but I see now I actually began with Siman Shin Lamed Gimel, which is a page earlier. But whatever it is, Shin Lamed Daled is one of the first simanim that I said a Dirshu share on, and there's a whole Siman Shin Lamed Daled, which the title of Siman Shin Lamed Daled is, let me turn back there, Dinei Dleika B'Shabbos. The halachas that pertain to chas v'shalom when there's a fire on Shabbos. How do you transport things out of the house? This halacha of taking clothing out of the house is actually more complex than just what's said over here in Sif Mem Daled. So really, we're going to save the complicated discussion of this halacha for later on for Siman Shin Lamed Daled. Mirz Hashem, we should all get there and learn it together in good health, and we'll discuss the complexities of this halacha over there. Now let's move along to Sif Mem Hey. Mi shenishru kelav b'mayim. Somebody whose clothing got wet from water. Now we're going to have to discuss how it got wet. The Mishnah Berurah is going to say right away, you know what, let's learn the Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah is cut and kuf samach aleph b'mayim. Your clothing got wet from water, bein al yidei mei hageshamim, whether they got wet from rain, or the clothing fell into the river, or you fell into the river while you were wearing the clothing. And your clothing got wet. So there's two different ways that the Mishnah Berurah notes your clothing might have gotten wet. They might have gotten wet from the rain, or they might have gotten wet from you tripping and falling into the lake. What's the difference? The difference is that one would think that if your clothing got wet because you fell into the lake, your clothing are going to be a lot wetter than if they got wet from the rain, unless you got caught in a hurricane. But in a normal rain, how wet do your clothing get already? You fall in the lake, your clothing got soaked. That does make a difference, which we'll see in a moment. But again, let's go back into the Mechaber. Somebody whose clothing got wet from water, he's allowed to continue walking with them. He's allowed to wear the clothing even though the clothing are soaked. What's the chiddush over here? Says the Mechaber. Ve'enoi chayshesh shemeyavai lidei schita. Says the Mechaber, one might think that if you're wearing soaking wet clothing, you're very uncomfortable. You don't like that your clothing are very wet. You might come to wring your clothing out. Now, wringing your clothing out would be a very big problem, because wringing out your clothing is a tolada of the malach of koives, of laundering. You're not allowed to do schita. You're not allowed to squeeze out. It also could be a tolada of dosh, of threshing, which is extracting something from what it is contained in. When you thresh grain, you take the grain out of the chaff. When you wring out clothing, you're taking the water out from the fabric that it's removed in, that it's contained in, it's absorbed in. So this could be a tolada of koives. It's part of the laundering process, right? You get your laundry all wet, and then you wring out the water. It's also a tolada of dosh. So we would think that there's room here for Gzeira D'Rabbanan. We don't want you wearing soaking wet clothing, because you might come to squeeze them out. Says the Mechaber, it's not a problem. Now, it's also brought down in halacha that there's another chiddush over here, which is a maris ayin concept. If you're walking around wearing soaking wet clothing, somebody might look at you and say, wow, it looks like this guy did a wash. He's wearing wet clothing. Maybe he washed his clothing and didn't have time for it to dry. That's also not a problem. We're not chayshish for such a thing. So again, the opening halacha here of Sif Mem Hey, your clothing got wet, maybe they even got soaking wet. You're allowed to wear them. We're not chayshish, says the Mechaber, that you might come to perform the malacha of schita. We're not afraid of that. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Kuf Samach Aleph, we did already. Now, in Kuf Samach Aleph, the Mishnah Berurah said that maybe the clothing got wet because he got caught in the rain. Maybe the clothing got wet because he fell into the nar, he fell into the river. What's the difference? The Mishnah Berurah, the Chavetz Chaim didn't write this because he had extra ink in his pen. The truth is that the Rishonim already talk about this. There is a difference between the two. Like I said, if you fell in the river, your clothing is going to be a lot wetter. Now, if the whole chiddush over here is, we're not afraid that you're going to come to schita, we're not afraid that you're going to wring your clothing out, you would think that there's more of a reason to be concerned that you might come to schita if you fell in the river. If you fell in the river and your clothing and mom is soaking wet, there's a greater concern that you might actually come to wring them out. Kamash Malan, the Mishnah Berurah over here, no. There's no worry, there's no gzeira that you can't wear the clothing because you might come to schita, even if you fell in the river and your clothing is soaked. Even then, we don't have gzeira of schita. Says the Mishnah Berurah, you're allowed to wear the clothing. Now, the Mechaber said, you're allowed to wear the clothing, and we're not chayshish that you might come to schita. Why not? Why taka? Why are we not chayshish? Says the Mishnah Berurah, Shaloi asru ala adam habegadim shaloi veish oisan. We don't make a gzera on the clothing that a person is wearing. Now he brings this down. If you take a look at Ois Kat Reish Beis in the Sharet Tzion, he brings this down from the Bach, from the Pri Megadim. He says he found the same thing in the Meiri, And the lashon that I saw brought down in the Aruch HaShulchan, and it's not the Aruch HaShulchan's own lashon. The Aruch HaShulchan took it from the Taisus Yomtiv on this Mishnah. This is based on a Mishnah. The Taisus Yomtiv on the Mishnah says, why is it that we don't make an Isser on the clothing that you're wearing? Says the Taisus Yomtiv, Shaloi hitrichu chachamim livshoit begadav. The Chachamim will not matriach you to take off your clothing because of a concern that you might come to schita. The Gadol kavod habrius, because kavod habrius is doicha the gzera d'Rabbanan. What are we going to do? We're going to make a gzera that you can't wear wet clothing, so you fell into the river, now we're going to tell you have to strip in Rishus Harabim? No. It's a gzera. It's not just a darais over here. It's a gzera. It's a concern you might come to schita. The Chachamim did not make their gzera at the risk of compromising somebody's kavod habrius. Now, continues the Mechaber, the Mishnah Berurah, and the Mishnah Berurah says, Nacha Chiddush. So what we're saying so far is, Shaloi Asra la Adam Abegadim Shaloi V'Shazan. Somebody's wearing clothing, he got caught in the rain, we're not going to tell him he has to take his clothing off. Somebody's wearing clothing, he fell in the river, bigger Chiddush, his clothing amamish drenched, we're not going to say he has to take his clothing off. Now, says the Mishnah Berurah, Va'afilu im nashru kelov levad, even if his clothing got wet alone, without him. In other words, this is clothing that he wasn't wearing. He had clothing that he wasn't wearing, and they got soaked. Hu loivshan mitchila u'mahalach behem. He's allowed to go put them on, and he's allowed to walk around with them. Okay, so the first one was, he's wearing his clothing. His clothing got wet. What are we going to do? Tell him he has to take his clothing off? Now we have a bigger chiddush. He wasn't wearing his clothing when his clothing got wet. I don't know what happened. The jacket that he was going to wear was in the basement in his house. His basement got flooded. His jacket is soaked. He's allowed to put on the jacket and go out on Shabbos. Where's the kavod habrius angle over there? Says the Mishnah Berurah, u'mistaber dainu dafke mein lo begadim acherim. The Mishnah Berurah qualifies it. He says when we have this heter over here, that you're allowed to put on the beged that got soaked even when it wasn't on you, that's only if it's the only jacket you have. You got to go to Mincha on Shabbos. You don't have another jacket. That's the jacket you were going to wear. It got soaked, you're allowed to go ahead and put it on. And in Sharetzion Oiskat Reish Gimel, the Chavetz Chaim says it has to be that way. It has to be that the heter only is if you have nothing else to wear. Why? Because he points out, the truth is, in the very next sif, in the Shulchan Aruch, in Sif Mem Vav, we're going to see that the Ramah says, soaking wet clothing is muktzah. You're not allowed to be metaltal soaking wet clothing. Why not? Because we're afraid you're going to come to wring it out. So, says the Chavetz Chaim, I mean, I see over here a Pri Begadim, a Bach, that says that you're allowed to put on an article of clothing that got wet even when you weren't wearing it. Says the Chavetz Chaim, hold it, we need to qualify this. A soaking wet article of clothing, we're going to learn in Men Vav, you're not allowed to be metaltal it. So how are you telling me you're allowed to put it on? You're not even allowed to be metaltal it. Elamai, it must be what the Bach, the Pri Begadim, what they're saying is, if this is the only jacket that you have, it's the only article of clothing that you have, you don't have anything else to wear, then it's not Aser B'Tiltal, and you are allowed to put it on. Again, why? Because of kavod habrius. Because of kavod habrius, we're going to relax the gzera that says that you can't handle it and you can't wear it because you might come to schita. Okay, now let's go further in the Mechaber. Says the Mechaber, 3 lines down. So now you have this wet garment. Says the Mechaber, when you have a wet beged, v'lo yishtachem lenagvam. You're not allowed to hang them out to dry. You're not allowed to go spread them out to dry. Why? Mipnei marasayin. Because of marasayin. What's the marasayin? Explains the Mechaber. Shelo yecheshtu shekibsan b'Shabbos. That people shouldn't suspect that you did laundry on Shabbos. So, again, you got caught in the rain. You're allowed to wear the clothing. Why? Why don't we make a gzera that you might come to schita? Kavod habrius. You're allowed to wear the wet clothing. Okay, now you come home. You have this wet clothing. Says the Mechaber, you're not allowed to spread them out to dry them. Why? Because people might be chayshish that you went ahead and you did laundry on Shabbos. And says the Mechaber, since this is also because of Marasayin, va'afilu b'chadrei chadorim she'ein sham royim, even if you want to do this mamish behind closed doors, you want to do it in chadrei chadorim, you're not even allowed to do it in chadrei chadorim. 1 second. Just checking something in the safer over here. Bear with me for 1 second. Yeah. So even b'chadrei chadarim, even behind closed doors, you're not allowed to go ahead and spread out and hang out your clothing to dry, because when something is also because of Marasayan, it's even also to do it bitzina. Says the Mishnah Berurah in Ois Cotton Kuf Samach Gibel. V'lo yishtachem. You're not allowed to spread out wet clothing in order to dry them. Ayin Magen Avram, take a look at the Magen Avram. Shem Tzadid Loimar takes the position to say, the dafka kishenishra b'mayim. This is only true when they really became soaked with water. But if they got a little bit wet, you can hang it up to dry. When something just got a little bit wet, nobody is going to look and say, oh, look, he did laundry. Laundry gets soaking wet. Laundry doesn't get a little bit wet. So this Isser, says the Magen Avram, to hang out something to dry is only if it got seriously wet. However, that's a Magen Avram. There are others, El Yerabba, Shulchan Atzei Shitim, Chai Adam, Shulchan Shloimeh. They don't take the same position as the Magen Avram. Ois Cotton Kuf Samach Daled. You're not even allowed to do this bechadrei chadarim va'afilu, says the Mishnah Berurah, ubegadim amalapefim behem tinoikos shekarin vindalin. Back in the day, when they used cloth diapers, we don't even know from this, but back in the days, I remember cloth diapers. Back in the days when they used cloth diapers, the cloth diapers that you use for a baby, those you would have been allowed to hang out to dry. Even mamish publicly, they came in the yeshalem gam tzayas, because they're dirty, they're soiled. No one's going to look at the soiled baby diaper and say, oh, he did laundry. It's dirty. It's hanging out there to dry up. There would be no room for a chshad. Says the Mishnah Berurah, it could be even if they're not really soiled. If they're not really soaked with urine, so the hakol, it's still mutter. If it's really totally soaked with urine, then it looks more like you're hanging out laundry to dry because it's dripping wet, like wet laundry. But if it's not dripping wet like wet laundry, you could put it out to dry. Because when people see baby diapers hanging out, they understand what's going on. They understand that these are articles of clothing that got soiled and you're just putting them out to dry so that they shouldn't get moldy. But you have to remember a halacha that we're going to learn a little bit further, which is that to take something that's wet and hang it next to a furnace where the liquid absorbed in the garment could become heated to the degree of Yatze Ledesbai, that presents a different problem, a potential problem of Bishul. Ice cotton, kuf samet. Okay, the Mechaber told us a very important concept. When something is also because of Maris Ayin, it's even also b'chadrei chadarim. It's even also behind closed doors. In other words, you don't say, oh, it's only also because somebody might see and he might say. No, so now I'll do it behind closed doors. No one's going to see it. No, if it's aser because of Marasayan, it's even aser behind closed doors. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the reason for this is when the Chachamim made a takana and they said something is aser because of Marasayan, it's aser in public, it's aser in private. Kasra Taisis for a rush. Taisis and the rush both say, there's a very yesodistic Mishnah Berurah over here. This idea This concept that something that's also because of Maris Ayin is also even privately, that's only true when people who will see what you're doing will suspect that you're being over on a din daraisa, something that's been out Torah. Kegoin kan bekibus, like over here. Over here, if you spread out wet clothing to dry, someone is going to think that you were over on the Isser Daraisa of Kibbutz. Laundering is one of the Lamites Malachas. That's an Isser Daraisa. Bazeh also Afil B'chad V'chadar. That kind of Marasayan and Isser Daraisa, that's also even B'tzina, even behind closed doors, B'chad V'chadar. Ma'ashe'en kem b'davar shehu Isser Darabanan, Afil L'ma she'yizburu haroyim. But by something which is a maris ayin on a derabanan, lo yichmiru lesser b'zeh b'farhesia. That's only also when done in public. V'hu v'dav zeh b'magen Avram v'tazu shari achrayim, magen Avram, taz, other achrayim, all say this as well. Okay, it's cut kuf samach vav, so it would be also to spread out the laundry because of maris ayin. Says the Mishnah kuf samach vav al kain. Based on this halacha, al luntis, a towel. Shemeviyoi be'erev Shabbos, that you brought on Erev Shabbos. You went to the mikvah on Erev Shabbos. Now you come back with a wet towel. Kishuulach, you're bringing this towel back when it's wet. Mi beis hamerchatz, from the bathhouse or from the mikvah. Yishtachenu l'nagvoi mi ba'oyoyim. You want to spread it out to dry. You want to put it on the rack to dry. You want to hang it on the line to dry. You have to hang it up on Erev Shabbos. V'lo ad achar hashkia. Don't wait till lift Geshkia. Don't wait till Ben Hashmoshes to go hang it up, because now you're hanging out laundry to dry on Shabbos. That's also because of Maris Ayin. So do it before Shabbos. Now, if you did it before Shabbos, can it remain there on Shabbos? The answer is yes. We're going to see that a little bit later in the shir. If it's a towel that you're going to need on Shabbos, so you took a towel to the mikvah on Erev Shabbos, you're going to need this towel again tomorrow, Shabbos day. So then we would be matir for you to put it out to dry before Tzeisak Echavim, during Ben Hashmoshes. Actually, but you have to make sure not to squeeze it out. Now, I know a lot of you right now are wondering in your heads. All right, so I went to shul Friday night, and I got caught in the rain, and my coat is wet. What am I allowed to do with my coat, and what am I not? Let's finish the sif first. Continues the Mechaber. 4 lines down the middle of the line. V'loi osru ela l'shatchan b'Shabbos. This idea that you're not allowed to put out wet clothing to dry is only on Shabbos. But if you had wet laundry on Erev Shabbos that needs to be put out to dry, you put out laundry to dry on Erev Shabbos, it could stay there the whole Shabbos. You're not mechuyev to remove it, right? So the chiddush over here is, you don't say, oh, I hung my laundry out to dry Friday afternoon. Oh, before Shabbos, I better bring the laundry in. Otherwise, people are going to see it on Shabbos and going to be choshed that I did laundry on Shabbos. No, this Isser is only to hang something up on Shabbos. If you hung it up on Erev Shabbos, it's allowed to remain there. Says the Mishnah Berurah, you're not mechuyev to remove this drying laundry, even if it's hanging very publicly. The reason is, the room for a concern that people are going to be choshed that you did laundry on Shabbos is only if they see you hanging up wet clothing on Shabbos. Then there's room to think. Somebody sees you hanging out wet laundry on Shabbos. It mamish looks like you did laundry on Shabbos. Somebody sees you hanging wet laundry on Shabbos. What are they going to say? Oh, this guy must have done laundry on Erev Shabbos, and now he's hanging it out to dry at 12 o'clock in the afternoon on Shabbos. No, you do laundry on Erev Shabbos, you hang it on Erev Shabbos. You don't hang it on Shabbos. So if you hung it up before Shabbos, it's allowed to stay there. When people see you hanging up wet clothing on Shabbos, they don't know that it got wet on Shabbos. I guess if it's pouring, they do know. But If you had a flood in your basement, they don't know about it. So if they see you hanging laundry on Shabbos, they're going to be chayshish that you did laundry on Shabbos. Now, Lamaisa, like I always say, where does this come back to us? So you went out Friday night, came back from shul, and your coat is soaking wet. It says over here, halacha mefureshes in the mechaber, you have wet begadim on Shabbos. You're not allowed to hang them out to dry because of chashash. People might think that you did laundry on Shabbos. So there are various heterim over here. First of all, this halacha only pertains when you hang the begadim in the manner in which you hang laundry. So could you take your wet coat, take clothespins, and put it on the laundry line? No, you can't. Should you take it if you have one of those folding laundry racks in your house that you use to dry clothing? Should you put it out on that? No, you should not. If you have a rack in your laundry room where you hang laundry to dry, should you hang your wet coat over there? No, you should not. You want to put it on a hook by the front door where you hang coats? Gesundheit. You have a hook by your side door and you'd rather that it drips over there than it drips by the front door? Gesundheit. Hang it over there. There are those, I believe, that don't like the idea of hanging it over the bathtub because people hang laundry over there. I'm not going to paskin for you. I would tell you ask your LOR. But I think it depends to a certain extent what the derech is. Is that your derech? Do you hang laundry that way? I don't know. When you hang laundry that way, do you put it on a hanger and hang it over there? If it's not the derech of hanging laundry, then it's not a problem. Another heter is when you're dealing with garments that are dry cleaned. So your coat. Nobody puts a coat in the washing machine. I'm talking about like a Shabbos coat, like a trench coat, an all-weather coat, a wool coat. These are not items that go in the washing machine. And these are not items that you wash at home. So no one's going to think, oh, you washed your coat. And now you're putting it out to dry. Your coat goes to the dry cleaner. So this is a heter, I believe, that's brought down in the Shmir Shabbos Kilchasa from Rav Shlomo Zalman, that if it's something that's dry clean only, then there's really no room for a chashash. Okay, let's move along to Sif Mem Vav. 5 lines down, says the Mechaber. Begadim hashruyim b'mayim. Articles of clothing that get seriously wet from water. Asur l'nagvam samach la'esh. You're not allowed to dry them near a fire. Now, this is not only a fire. It's next to a heat source. You're not allowed to put them out to dry by a heat source. Says the Mishnah, the Mechaber uses a lashon over here. It's not begadim that got a little wet. It's begadim hashruyim b'mayim, clothing that was soaked in water. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, the diak is actually the other way. Says the Mishnah Berurah, afilu shriyim uetes. Yeah, because we're talking about bishul over here. Even if it only got a little bit wet, even if it's only a little bit wet, there's still a problem. He brings this down from the Magen Avram. Says the Mishnah also lenagvam. You're not allowed to dry them by a fire or by a heat source. Afal gavda afilu bechama aser v'chanal. Now wait a second. We just said in Sif Mem Hey that you're not allowed to spread out laundry to dry, even if it's not by a heat source. So now we're coming by Mem Vav and saying, oh, you're not allowed to do it by a heat source? You're not even allowed to do it not by a heat source because of Marasayan. Explains the Mishnah Berurah. Hasa mishum Marasayan l'chudhu. Mem Hey, spreading out the laundry to dry, was an Issa D'Rabbanan. It was a Marasayan problem. It was Xera because of Marasayan. People might suspect you of doing an Issa D'Oraisa. The Kamash Balon Hacha over here in Mem Vav, the Mechaber is teaching me the negative Eish Iser Torah, to hang out your clothing to dry, your wet clothing by a heat source. That could be an Iser Daraisa, not just Marasayan. What's the Iser Daraisa? Mishum Mevashel. You might come to cook the water. If the water that's on the clothing, if the temperature of that water could hit Yad Seledes, the temperature that your hand would jump back from, right? That would be an Issa Daraisa. The Issa of Bishul on a liquid is when you bring it up to the degree of Yad Seledes boy. That's already an Issa Daraisa. And says the Mishnah Berurah, there's another possible Issa Daraisa. Umishum Melabein. That is also laundering. How is putting wet clothing by a heat source laundering? The derek lihislabein al yedei tanur, because by heating up a wet garment in an oven, that actually has a whitening effect. Kedarmina Shabbos Chavzayin Bebeis, like the Gemara says in Masechta Shabbos, Ha'unin shel pishton mishe yislabnu. They would take bundles of flax during the process of producing linen. They would take the wet linen and they would put it by a kiln, and that somehow would have a whitening effect. So putting a wet garment by a heat source could be a problem daraisa of bishul. It could also be a problem in daraisa of mislabin, of doing malabin, koivis, doing laundry. V'gam, the also makmazel and nagvan afilu kushu lavish behem imhu oimid neged achayim b'makom sheyad tzeletis behem. Also says the Mishnah Berurah, there's another added chiddush here in Mem Vav over Mem Hey. In Mem Hey, when we spoke about the issur of putting out the wet clothing to dry because of a maris ayin gzera, so yeah, you can't take your wet clothing and put it on the clothing rack to dry. Over here in Mem Vav, where we're saying that you cannot dry wet clothing by a heat source, that means that you can't come in with wet clothing and go over to the fireplace and stand by the fireplace. You're not spreading out laundry to dry. Indeed, there's no maris ayin here, right? But over here, the problem is you can't do it because if you stand by the fireplace and it really gets warm and the wetness gets elevated to the degree of yatzeledes, you've got an issur daraisa. You also could have an issur daraisa of malabain. So that's the chiddush of Mem Vav. Now, let's see the Ramah here. 4 lines off the bottom, Hagah says the Ramah. Not only can you not dry the clothing near a fire or near a heat source, Hagah, for also letaltalam. The truth is, wet clothing that you're not wearing, you're not even allowed to be metaltal them. You're not allowed to handle them. They're muktzah. And this is what we mentioned earlier in the shir, right? We said, what do you mean that if your clothing got wet when you weren't wearing it, you're allowed to put it on? How are you allowed to put it on? The Ramah says right over here, wet clothing, you're not allowed to be metaltal. Now, first of all, now that we answered. We said, covered abrius. It's the only jacket you have. You're allowed to put it on. We relaxed this issur that the Ramah is talking about here. But what is this issur that the Ramah is saying? You're not allowed to handle wet clothing. Why? Because you might come. This is the gzera. You're not allowed to handle wet clothing because you might come to perform a schita. You're allowed to walk with your clothing if it's wet. Covered abrius. We relaxed this gzera. But here we have the gzera. The Ramah says you're not allowed to handle wet clothing. You might come to perform schita. However, this is only true with an article of clothing, with a fabric article that you want to dry. The Mishnah Berurah is going to say rags that get soaking wet all the time and you don't care. Those are not muktzah. Those you're allowed to handle. There's no gzera that you might come to wring them out. You don't care if they're wet. You're not going to come to wring them out. Continues the Ramah here, but because of this gzera, fascinating what the Ramah says. On Shabbos, there's an issur to walk in a place where there's a reasonable risk that you might slip and fall into water. Because we're afraid that your clothing might get soaked and you might come to squeeze or wring them out. Says the Mishnah Berurah. You're not allowed to dry the clothing near a fire. Says the Mishnah Berurah, another very pertinent halacha. You're not allowed to take your wet coat or your wet garment and put it on a furnace, on a wood-burning stove. Or, back in the day, I know when I grew up in an apartment building in Borough Park, you had the radiator that gets very hot. You're not allowed to take your wet coat and say, oh, I'll put it on the radiator so it should get dry. Let me tell you something. The building that I grew up in, we had steam heat. Now, there wasn't always heat. But when there was heat, that radiator got seriously hot. If you would take a wet coat and put it on that radiator, I guarantee you that water would become yatzeledes. That would be Bishul Daraisa. V'uadin da'asal anichan al atana b'makom sheyatzeh ledes b'hem. V'ha'olam nichshalin bazeh ba'avay niseinu arabim. Says the Chavetz Chaim, unfortunately, ba'avay niseinu arabim, a lot of people are nichshal in this halacha. Shemanichin b'chayrif b'gadam lachem al tanur cham l'nagvan. They come in from the snow or from the rain, and they take their coat off and they put it on the stove to dry it. If it can't reach Yatsa Ledes, then it wouldn't be an Issa Daraisa. As long as you're not doing it the way you spread out laundry. If you're doing it the way you spread out laundry to dry, then it's Memhei. Then it's an Issa of Marasayan. But if you don't lay it out in the manner in which you lay out laundry to dry, so then there's no Marasayan. And if it can't get heated to the degree of Yatzeledis, there's no Bishul. But if it could get hot to the degree of Yatzeledis, Bishul Daraisa. The Ramah said, you're not allowed to handle the wet clothing. This halacha, the Mishnah Berurah says, that you're not allowed to handle wet clothing, because you might come to schita, but that's only when it's seriously wet. A towel got a little wet, we're not afraid that you're going to wring it out. We're not afraid that you're going to come to wring it out. Got a little damp, you're not going to wring it out. Come on, Simishin Beis, if test Bahago. The Ramah said this halacha only pertains with articles that you're makpid. You don't want them to be wet, so you might wring them out. But rags and that are always soaking wet in water, ain't lochish. We don't have to be concerned. You might come to do schita. You don't care if they're wet. Mutter b'tiltal, and therefore it would be mutter to handle them on Shabbos. Thank you so much for joining me for Libanat Torah. Discuss of Libanat Torah should be Megan against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shem should send Yeshua's refuahs, parnas, and shaduchim to all those in need. We should be zeichet to see the Biaskal Tzedek B'mherav Yameinu Amen. Be well.